Virgil asked if I would do this so that we could save his voice a little bit, but it's good to see Virgil, but we need to keep praying for Virgil.
Thank you for your prayers last couple of weeks. I have no idea what I have had. It's not COVID. I've been tested twice for it. This also went through our grandchildren, and our granddaughter was tested for COVID. Came back negative for her. So I don't know what it is, but it's nasty. I am on the mend. My aches are gone. My fevers are gone. But I am weak and I have a nasty cough, so please don't make me laugh. If I start laughing, that's it. So, first of all, I want you to ignore this date. That's how old this lesson is. I was trying to prepare this for 2 weeks ago, and I drove poor Allison nuts. I email my lessons to Allison so she can put it up online for the folks who are watching. And since I was home with nothing to do, I kept tweaking it. So I kept sending her updates. But I did not tweak the dates. Okay, so we've been talking about God's agape. His agape love for us. And now 3 weeks ago, we were talking about our reflection of that agape toward other people. And at that point, I was sharing some thoughts I have about the fall that I want to get into this morning, and about how, as a result of the fall, we have a natural, inbred tendency to not love with agape love. And it's becoming clearer and clearer to me, and there's just a constant battle going on between what is in our hearts as a result of the fall and what God is restoring in our hearts as He transforms us into the image of His Son. So let's get going. And this is just more review, but again, for this study, I've been using William Barclay's book, New Testament Words, in which he has a whole chapter on agape love. And this is one of his quotes from that book. Christian love means unconquerable benevolence and invincible goodwill. No matter what any man does to him, the Christian will never cease to seek that man's highest good. So the essence of agape is that we're looking outward. We're constantly looking outward. We're constantly looking out for another person's highest and best good. And the scriptures indicate this in Philippians 2:3. It says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." And so when I read this verse, and I look at those words in red, selfish ambition or conceit, it begs the question in my mind, where's that come from? Where do we get selfish ambition and conceit? From the fall. We get it from the fall, selfish ambition and conceit. And so now what I want to do, if you'll indulge me a little bit, go back about 2 years in our lessons to when we were looking at Genesis and we were looking at the fall. And let's look at what life was like before the fall. And this is in Genesis 2. "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and shall hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And then it says, you wonder, why did Moses feel it important to say this? "And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." I mean, why even put that in there? What's that got to do with anything? That's not rhetorical. I'm inviting you guys to talk as much as you want to talk this morning, to save me, Margaret.
Yeah, let's think of that. That's interesting because I think, the fact that they were innocent before they ate of the fruit, when they said that, it's the knowledge of good and evil. And so they weren't focused on themselves. They were just enjoying what God gave them. And then that happened, and they all of a sudden were realizing, things they hadn't realized before. Not that it was bad to be naked before, but I'm just saying it was God was just, their minds were opened up to things. They wanted to hide.
Yeah, I mean, we spent several weeks a couple years ago just trying to grasp what this tree of the knowledge of good and evil means. And I think obviously there is a connection with this verse 25. The man and his wife were both naked and not ashamed. And I shared with you several weeks ago that as I've been developing these thoughts in my mind about the fall, I've been looking for others who have shared similar thoughts. And I came across a little article written by Chuck Swindoll. The Origin of Self is the name of the article. And I just love some of the things he says. I got a couple quotes from him. But this is the first one. And here he's talking about the pre-fall state. Mm-hmm. Naked, laid bare, open, no secrets. That explains why they were not ashamed. There existed in that place a remarkable openness, a lack of self-consciousness in each other's presence. Their discussions, their actions, all their conversations were non-defensive, unguarded, and with no focus on self. Imagine being able to live like that. Imagine that. I mean, there's another screen I'll get to in a couple slides. If Ron were here, he'd already be there. But in a couple slides, I got another quote from Chuck Swindoll, and he talks about the self-consciousness being all that we have ever known. It's all we have ever known. And here, prior to the fall, Adam and Eve have no consciousness of it. And I've been trying to wrap my head around this, trying to get a sense of what that must have been like. And quite honestly, go ahead, Margaret,
I'm
please.
sorry, there's just
No, don't be sorry.
nothing to guard yourself from. There had been no sin. There was nothing wrong with the place. There was nothing. I think our self-consciousness, my guardedness is I'm afraid I'm going to be embarrassed, or someone's going to misunderstand me, or all of these things. But there was none of that. They walked in the garden with God.
There was no sense of a need to protect yourself from anybody.
Right.
There was no sense of vulnerability, no sense of fragility, no sense of any of that. They were just completely free and completely innocent. They were walking in the garden with God. I just
said, wow.
Yeah, wow. It was wow. There's just a total lack of an awareness of self.
Well, since there was no sin, there was nothing to be ashamed of.
No sin, nothing to be ashamed of. Yeah, Carol.
They were only out to please God.
Sure.
And not, man.
Yeah, they were out to please God, or maybe even to please each other, but they weren't concerned about pleasing themselves. That to me, that's the real flip that takes place when the fruit gets eaten. Adam, obviously we're speculating. I mean, we're trying to speculate based on what the scriptures tell us. And, again, we're talking about something that was written 1,500 some odd years before Christ, written in a Jewish culture to a Jewish people. We can't understand this. At least I can't. I'm looking at this through 21st century Southern Bible Belt eyes. And I'm trying to understand what a 15th century BC audience, how they would have read that phrase, they were naked and unashamed, what that would have meant to them. But it's in that phrase that we're getting these ideas and these speculations, and I think Chuck Swindoll's right on this. A lack of self-consciousness, a lack of self-awareness. They're non-defensive, they're unguarded, with no focus on self. And then all of that changes when we get into chapter 3. Genesis 3. They eat of the fruit. Okay, he's told them not to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and they eat of it, and the immediate consequence, this is before the curses that come later, the immediate consequence, then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And I asked myself, why did they feel the need to do that? Okay? And the reason I asked the question, they're the only two people there, and they're married. Who are they hiding themselves from?
God.
Okay, from God. Okay?
It was the original camouflage.
Yeah, the original camouflage. They're now ashamed. They know they're naked, and that bothers them.
They're conscious of themselves.
They are conscious of themselves. Okay? This is the origin of that dream we all have when we're sitting for me, I'm always sitting in 4th grade classroom naked. I don't know why, but that's where yeah, and I don't know why I picked 4th grade, but that's where my brain goes. And you know, this is the origin of those dreams that we have where we're just bare to the world and we just don't know what's going on. And this is again, this is separate and apart from where God tells Eve that she's going to, you know, have pain in childbirth, and He tells Adam that he's going to work by the sweat of his brow. This is all separate from this. This is the natural consequence of eating of this fruit. The knowledge of good and evil. And as we talked several weeks ago, you know, when I believe that when the Bible talks in terms of knowledge, that knowledge is this, that, and the other thing. We're talking experiential knowledge. We're not just talking about head knowledge. Okay, so they knew that they were naked. They experienced the feeling of being naked, and it bothered them greatly. And so they're sewing up fig leaves together, and they're becoming very much self-aware. Another writer, John Piper, put it this way: suddenly they are self-conscious about their bodies, and now there is shame. Okay, there's shame. Now, I don't know what it is about the human race, but you know, I don't know of, I'm just going to get embarrassing now. You know, I don't know of anybody who likes the way they look naked. And so we cover ourselves up. And we're the only biological animals on the planet that wears clothing. And it's fairly universal throughout the world. All human beings wear some form of clothing. And so this is interesting, because you know, you look at your pets, your dogs, your cats, or whatever, they're all running around naked. They don't care, because they don't have that sense of self-consciousness. We've been cursed with it. We are aware of ourselves, and now we feel a need to protect ourselves. And here's the Swindoll cover-up, or not cover-up, but the Swindoll after effect. There was a sudden, shocking realization they were naked. Suddenly, those two became self-conscious. They'd never known those feelings before, and you and I have never known anything else. And to me, that has gripped me. That has absolutely gripped me, to realize that this state of self-consciousness, this post-fall self-consciousness, is all we have ever known. So when we are coming to Jesus Christ for salvation, we're really coming to Him to learn a state of being that is completely foreign to us. All we have ever known is feelings of self-consciousness. What we read here in Genesis, Swindoll goes on, what we read here in the Genesis account is the origin of self-awareness, self-concern, and selfishness. And that's all we have ever known. To the point now, yeah, David, please help me.
I just think it's interesting about child development because, our little kids would come running around, our grandchildren would come running around the swimming pool with no clothes on.
Yep.
And they're not old, they're young. And as you get older, you pass that on to them that that's not appropriate. Christ tells us to be like children because they're pure in heart. Not their nature is not, but a lot of the behaviors that are negative behaviors we pass on to them.
Yep.
It's almost like you're not polluted. Cover yourself. Be polluted like we are. Cover yourself.
Yeah.
It's almost that kind of thing. And another note, when you have a child that has some kind of inadequate physical development or mental development, most of the time they don't get it until they start getting right out of their kids. They're not self-conscious of a birthmark that's right on the side of their face.
Right.
It's this big, and then kids start making fun of it, then they become self-conscious of it.
Yeah.
But we almost train our kids to become this way.
Yes.
We indoctrinate them to cover yourself.
Yeah.
Be embarrassed about this. You're not saying that, but basically
That's the lesson that gets learned eventually.
That's the lesson that gets learned.
Yeah. You're right. Carol and I last night, we were babysitting our grandchildren. Our son-in-law and daughter went down to Atlanta to see a play, and so we gave them their baths, and they're little grandchildren, and the thing they love to do, they get out of the bathtub and run around the house naked. And that's just their big thrill. And
A good way to dry them off.
yeah, air dry.
Saves on house.
So yeah.
Well, that's such a normal thing. Even there's a movie that Disney, or I think it was a Pixar movie called Inside Out, and it follows the growth and development of a young girl up until like she's, I think, 11 or 12. When she's a toddler, she's running around naked. Obviously you don't see her like fully.
Right.
I think you see her rear end, and it's funny, but
Right.
that's just so common to child development.
Right. So we develop this self-awareness, self-concern, and selfishness. And let's be fair on the flip side, when we're talking about children running around innocent and naked, at the same time, those same children, without any prompting from ourselves, know how to fight over toys.
Oh, yeah.
And that's mine. Don't take, we have to teach them to share. We have to teach them those things. So there is a certain inbred selfishness that comes right from the fall, even before we start training them. So it's interesting. I would love to study that more. So now we've got with the fall, we have a self-consciousness that has now permeated the entirety of humanity. And I've got another quote from another writer, a guy by the name of Morgan Guyton. He's in the Methodist tradition, and he puts it this way: because their eyes were opened to their nakedness, they died from the life of innocent dependence upon God and entered into the frightful, defensive existence of self-preservation. Self-preservation. This is what we end up with in the fall. We end up with a preoccupation with preserving ourselves, protecting ourselves. With our self-awareness comes an awareness of our place and time. I was listening to another gentleman talk about one of the things that happened with Adam and Eve is they became aware of the fact of the passage of time. This is something that animals don't grasp. Okay, I have heard from people who claim to know these things, like when you leave your dog home alone and you leave for the day, he has no idea you're coming home later. He has no idea. He has no concept of an hour from now or 2 hours from now. And that's why when you come home, they act like, oh my gosh, this is the greatest thing on the planet, because they had no sense that that was going to happen. We have an awareness of our place in time. And according to this one author, the way he put it was, this is one of the reasons why labor became so difficult for Adam, because he was no longer just working for his daily bread, but he's working to save up for next week's bread, and the bread after that, and the bread after that. Now we're aware of the fact that we're going to live decades into the future, and now we feel a need to prepare for those decades into the future, and we're no longer praying for daily bread. We're saving up savings, and we're doing this and that and the other thing, and we're working very hard. You know, we go to work, and we're working hard not so that we can put food on the table today, but so that we can build up a retirement so that we can put food on the table 40 years from now after we retire. And that's what we're working so hard for. And with this obviously comes an awareness of death. Humans were the only biological animals that realized we're going to die. We know that. And now we've got to deal with that. We become aware of our flaws, both physical flaws and emotional flaws. We become aware of everything. We're awareness of our own vulnerability, our own fragility. And as a result of all this, we end up living lives of self-protection, self-preservation, and self-promotion. And we do this all at the expense of others. We do this all at the expense of others. And so now we've got this tension. We've got God saying, okay, we've got the Bible telling us that God is love, that we have been created in the image of God, but now we've come with this complete self-awareness, self-consciousness arising from the fall, so that all we care about is our own survival and our own advancement, and we're willing to set other people aside to protect ourselves and to promote ourselves. And so now this sanctification process that God has us on to transform us back into the image of Jesus, who is the perfect image of God, the Father, this is to get rid of this and to replace it again with God's agape love. And yet we've got this tension that we're fighting against all the time. And it seeps into absolutely everything. Our self-interest infiltrates everything that we do. It infiltrates our relationships. And I'll get more on that in a few more slides. Our business dealings. Think about this, and I'm not saying this to put anybody on a guilt trip. I'm just thinking about this. I think about this in my own life, and every time you go into a business dealing, whose interests are you thinking about? And let me just put it to you this way. How many of us have ever gone into a car dealership where the biggest thing on our mind was maximizing the dealership's profits? You know, how often do we go into it? You know, we're doing everything we can to get that car for as cheap as we can get it. Okay? Why? Because that's good for me. It may not be good for the dealership, but I don't care. I mean, the reality is I don't care. I don't care about the dealership. I want to get the best deal I can for me. And I throw that out there, and I realize that this is universal thinking, and I'm wondering how this all fits in with Christianity. Let me just share an example of what I'm talking about. George MacDonald, my hero George. He's one of his novels, and I can't remember which one it was. He always has a main character in his novels, who's living a godly life far beyond anything that you and I could dream of living. And as you're reading these novels, you're sitting there thinking, George, this isn't real. Nobody can be that Christ-like. And as soon as you say that, you realize, oh my gosh, what did I just say? Nobody can be that Christ-like. And so in this novel, this guy, the main character, owns this large manor house that takes place in Scotland. And he has this large manor house that he needs to sell. And there's a buyer that comes along and he wants to buy the house. Well, the man selling the house knows that the buyer needs a place to live, and he knows something about the buyer's financial circumstances and stuff. And so he deliberately sells the house below market value to benefit the buyer. And you're reading that and you're thinking, I'm not going to do that. We're going to negotiate, we're going to horse trade, I'm going to bring that buyer up to my price, et cetera, et cetera. And so the buyer buys the house, and the story goes on, and later, the guy who just bought the house falls on financial hard times. So now he has to sell the house to take care of his family. Well, our hero comes back to buy the house that he had just sold. And when he buys it, he deliberately pays more than fair market value, again, to help out the guy who needs the money. So he sells low and buys high, the exact opposite of what we're taught to do. And as I'm reading this book, and I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, George, this isn't realistic, it doesn't work this way. And in the back of my mind, I hear George saying in the back of my mind, but yes, maybe it should. Maybe it should. And I wrestle with that. On my third bullet point there, I've got our economy is based on self-interest. And here I'm going back to my business ethics class that I've taught over at TFC. In America, we have a free market capitalistic economy. And one of the strongest proponents for this economy is an economist by the name of Milton Friedman. And if you've ever listened to him talk, from an economic standpoint, he makes a lot of sense. But what he tells us is that our economy is based upon and thrives upon, essentially, enlightened self-interest. The idea is I go out and I'm looking to buy products that are good for me, good for my family, and I'm going to want to pay as little as I can for those products. The seller, the manufacturer, he wants to maximize his profits. And so in order to maximize his profits, he tries to build a product that I'm going to want to buy. And I want to maximize the gain to myself. None of this is necessarily evil. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just simply saying we need to recognize that even in our own American free market economy, it is based upon people looking out for their own self-interest. And that's how it works. Our government, our politics, our legal system works the same way. In our legal system, we have what is known as the adversary system. The idea is you have a plaintiff who's filed a lawsuit, a defendant who's defending the lawsuit, and the system works when each of those people are looking out for their own self-interests, and they do the very best they can to promote their own self-interests, and somewhere in all that justice gets worked out. And yet, it's all based upon self-interest. Even our religion, our sense of salvation, our sense of public worship, self-interest is in here all the time. We're very self-conscious about it. You're standing up, and during worship time, if you're raising your hands, you're wondering if everybody's looking at you to see if you're the weirdo. And if you're not raising your hands, you're wondering if everybody's looking at you to see if you're the weirdo. Doesn't matter what you do, you're wondering what other people are thinking. When we're praying together corporately, you're wondering Gee whiz, I wonder if everybody likes my prayer, if they think my prayer is spiritual. Okay? That's in the back of our minds, let's admit it. Okay? When we think about salvation itself, why do we come to Jesus?
Avoid hell.
We don't want to go to hell. Okay?
That's why we come. It's not why we stay.
Yes, and maybe yes, and even McDonald points that out. He says, you know, we often come to Jesus with a prudent sense of self-preservation.
Sure.
There's a certain prudence to that, and yet, if that's where we stay in our life with Christ, we don't advance very far. And so, I mean, this self-interest just it infiltrates everything. MacDonald puts it this way. He says, for the one principle of hell is, quote, I am my own. I am my own king and my own subject. I am the center from which go out my thoughts. I am the object and end of my thoughts. Back upon me as the Alpha and Omega of life, my thoughts return. My own glory is and ought to be my chief care. My ambition to gather regards of men to the one center, myself. He's saying that's the principle of hell. That's the essence of hell, according to MacDonald. That I am my own person. And I am all that I think about and all that I care about. And so, with all this, we get into a sense of 4 rising emotions that come out of our sense of self-interest. Greed. We want what we want. Shame. We feel guilty all the time. Guilt and fear. And these are the emotions that follow us as a result of the self-consciousness, the self-awareness that comes from the fall. And this is what turned our innocent, self-ignoring state into a fallen state of complete self-awareness and self-consciousness. And you know, if I'm harping on this, is that I'm realizing how much of the fallen man is still in me, and how much and how far God still has to go in his sanctifying work and transforming me back into his image. And so we've got this tension going on, so that God wants me to love each one of you without even thinking about myself. And usually the way I do it is, or the way I think of it is, as a Christian, I'm going to basically live my life the way I want to, as long as I don't hurt anybody else. And that's about as far as it will go sometimes. As long as I don't hurt anybody, I'm going to do what I want. And I think God wants me to advance beyond that. It's more than just not hurting anybody else. Pastor, you about?
Yeah, no, this is why I find John Wesley's concept, his understanding of being entirely sanctified, wholly sanctified, achieving maybe I should say experiencing Christian perfection so helpful. Because Wesley says the essence of being thoroughly sanctified, experiencing Christian perfection, is where all our thoughts and all our actions are motivated only by love for God and love for other people. We're no longer motivated by selfishness.
Yeah.
And I find Simpson's understanding of sanctification really complementary to that, because he says you can only achieve that through union with Christ. Complete union with Christ, where you're leaning on him, rather than like we are in the garden, running from God, trying to do it on our own. For Simpson, the only way you're going to love God and love people all the time is if you really have this deep, abiding union, communion with Christ. So I love how I think their approaches to sanctification, they're not opposed to one another, they're very complementary.
Yeah. And let's never forget that image in the garden. When Adam and Eve sinned, it wasn't God who hid from them. It was they who hid from God.
Right.
Never forget that.
Right.
God did not turn his back on the sinners, Adam and Eve. He went looking for them,
Yeah, that's right.
and he still looks for us.
And you know, one of the dichotomies that I find that I've struggled with over the years is the fact that we're guilt-driven sometimes to do the things that we think please God.
Yes.
And so, you know, we don't want to say no to anyone that has a need. We don't want to, and I've had to be reminded, like in the 23rd Psalms, that he leads us beside still waters, gives us rest. He came apart and he took time. And then when those that were exhausted like, you know, Elijah on the mountain when Jezebel chased him, he sent his angels to minister. He sent his angels to minister to Jesus when he had had the temptation, you know? That's encouraging to me.
Yeah.
Because years ago, and Phil would know this lady too, there was a dear little lady in Toccoa that would drive around.
I know who you're
You know
talking about.
exactly what I'm talking about. She was so driven to please God, to do good work. She never, I mean, she was paranoid. And I remember reading in The Hiding Place about the sister, or was the aunt, one of the aunts of the Ten Boom ones, that just did so many good deeds, and when she was dying, and at the time they didn't know how to treat diabetes, she finally just her face lit up and she said, "It's not my works that have earned it. You know, I can go into his presence, you know, because he did it for me." And I think when we can get to seeing that, and we're driven by that greed, that shame, that guilt, that fear, and we start to see that that's, some of the most precious times of worship have been when I haven't been thinking about myself at all.
Yeah.
You know, your focus is on him, and so we really are. It's amazing that one phrase you said that comes over and over again, we've never known anything else. He has to lead us into those places. And he's gracious to do it.
Yeah, and you just reminded me of something else. There's a little bit of a rabbit trail from my slides, but you know, this becomes our primary motivation in life, even in our relationship with God. So we end up like Martin Luther, who was my hero before George MacDonald was. Martin would spend 6 hours at a time in confessional booth.
Yeah.
Because he was trying to confess perfectly. Because after all, the Bible says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us. So therefore, I have to confess my sins perfectly. And Martin put that upon himself. It was his fear of God that made him become a monk. It was his fear of God that made him try to do good works. As he put it, if anybody could gain heaven through monkery, he was the one. And yet it was all dirty, filthy rags. Because even when we are reaching out to do good deeds for other people or to do good things, if we're doing it because we're trying to appease an angry God, we're still not growing into the likeness of Jesus. Our motive, as Pastor just mentioned, to do everything out of love for God, not fear of him, love for him, and love for one another. Okay? I mean, that's totally different. It's one thing to give a homeless guy $10 because you think you'll earn a few brownie points with God. It's another thing to give a homeless guy $10 because a homeless guy may need $10. And because you love him and you want to reach out to him, or to give him a meal, or to do whatever. I mean, this fear governs our understandings of love. And we end up fearing rejection. And we end up fearing being alone. One speaker I was listening to, he said this fear of rejection is one of the strongest fears that we human beings have. And so what happens is we focus our attentions not so much on loving other people, but rather on being loved. And this has just, I've seen so many examples of this recently. I remember growing up as a kid, every year we always had to watch The Wizard of Oz.
Oh.
And it was, it was on every year, January or so. And those flying monkeys, they scared the poop out of me, and
They're still scary.
they're still scary. But I remember as a kid hearing the wizard say something to the Tin Man that I thought, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. And here's what he said. He said, a heart is not judged by how much you love, but by how much you are loved by others. And I thought to myself, wizard, you got that backwards. And as I was looking for the quote online, I found it on one of those little, 10 famous quotes from The Wizard of Oz, and it was on a Woman's World website. And this is the way they put it: as most of us can attest, the love of our friends and family is all that really matters in life. Now, I'm not going to say that that's necessarily wrong, but I think it is a fallen view of love. In the sense we're thinking about how much do other people love me.
Right.
I'm not thinking about loving other people. I'm thinking about how much am I loved. Okay? I always thought, that poor Tin Man, when the wizard says, your heart is judged by how much you're loved by others, I'm sitting there thinking, well, what can the Tin Man do to make other people love him? That's out of his control. He can't do anything about that. But he can choose to love. He can choose to love. Last time we were up in Ohio, I shared a few weeks ago that Carol and I went and saw our son. He's into community theater. He's been doing theater since high school, did it in Toccoa Falls, and now he's doing it community-wise. And they did this play entitled, I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. And it's a funny little play. It's a musical, and I've got some of the lyrics up on the screens. And as I was listening to this, every song, everything was focused on how can I make this other person love me? The focus was on loving me being loved, rather than me loving. And this is a lyrics from the opening song. They're getting ready for a first date. And here's what they're both saying, and both guys and girls are singing at the same time. Will my hopes be met? Will my fear dispel? Will I captivate or will I repel? Will I show him or her just how wonderful I am, or will I be a date from there? The focus, you're getting ready for this first date, and the self-consciousness is just oozing from your pores. You're concerned about whether or not you're going to make a good impression. You're concerned about whether or not they're going to like you. You're concerned about this, that, and the other thing. Later on, there's another song, and I won't get into the context of it. You can probably figure it out for yourself. We'll do as we please, and please hold me tight, for I will be loved. I will be loved. Yes, I will be loved tonight. And that's, the whole focus there, again, wasn't on, am I going to love somebody, but rather, am I going to be loved? And as I said before, this whole self-conscious focus permeates our relationships. So we've got fear gripping our hearts, even in our understanding of love. So we're afraid of being rejected. We're afraid of not being loved. And so John comes along and he saves us from this by saying there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not been perfected in love. Now this is in a different context from a romantic relationship, but this whole idea is that fear and love are completely incompatible. You cannot love somebody and be self-fearful at the same time. I mean, it's totally incompatible. I mean, if you've ever been in a state of depression or anxiety, hopefully you will have learned that the way to get yourself out of that is to stop thinking about yourself and start focusing on other people. Because when you're focusing on other people, you can't be focused on what you're afraid of and what's hurting you and what's upsetting you. Several weeks ago, I shared about this gentleman that we ran into at Toccoa Falls a couple months ago while we were walking around, and his name is Father Barnabas Powell, and he was a Toccoa Falls graduate about 25 years ago, and he is now the pastor of a Greek Orthodox church down in Cummings. And I was looking at some of his online sermons. He's been doing a series on love as well. And this is what he says in one of his sermons. Perfect love casts out fear. Fear has everything to do with punishment, and that's not the way God is. God isn't about punishment. And this is what he says. I think this is really interesting. The punishment that you think you feel from God is your stubborn inability to embrace being loved by God and being changed by that love for the rest of your life. That's what Martin Luther lived through for years and years and years until, one day he comes across Romans, the just shall live by faith, and suddenly he realizes, oh my gosh, I've been trying to appease an angry God all my life, and I don't have to, because that's not who God is. God isn't about retribution. He's not about pouring out his wrath on you because you've done something that every human being does. He's about saving you. He's about restoring you. He's about loving you. And the fear that we feel is our stubborn inability to embrace being loved by God. And once we are loved by God, and once we realize how much we're loved by God, then we can now focus outwards. Fear is a self-focused emotion, and the power of agape is a self-denial. Just the opposite. The opposite. There can be no fear for one who is consumed by an outward-focused love. I guess you can be fearful for the person you're loving, but that's a totally different situation. But the idea is that, if I'm loving you, I don't have time to think about myself. And so, I'm not sure what I get out of this to conclude it, other than realizing the immense power of the fall. And at least in my own life, how the results of that fall are still with us. As Chuck Swindoll says, that self-consciousness is all we have ever known. It is a daily companion, it's constantly doing battle with us, which is why we need to really drive ourselves into our relationship with Christ. We need to be very deliberate about this. This isn't about living our lives, not hurting anybody else, giving a few bucks in the offering plate and thinking that's our Christianity. Our Christianity is about practicing the presence of God, learning to drive deep into our relationship with Jesus Christ, learning to see how much he loves us, so that now we can forget about ourselves. We can stop worrying about self-promotion, self-preservation, and self-protection, and start focusing more outward. MacDonald says that man's business is to do the will of God, and God will take care of the man. And the more we understand that God is taking care of us, and he will take care of us, then we can let go of some of this curse of the fall. Yeah, Phil?
I've been reading a book by John Piper called Godward Living, and it's a compilation of short devotions that he has put together in this one book. And this morning, one of the sections that I read was pleasing God rather than man, which fits right in with what we've been talking about. We're so self-conscious about ourselves. And the scripture that John had right at the beginning of the chapter of this was in Ephesians chapter 6. And he says, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. So the good that we do, the Lord's gonna give back to us. If that is our mindset and that is our motive with what we are doing and not focusing on ourselves, but as we've been talking this morning, focusing on others and in so doing pleasing the Lord.
Okay. Yeah, David.
I've talked about this before, but there's a revival of hedonism in our society, our culture. And if you don't know that the hedonist in Greek in ancient times is the prime motive is to seek physical and emotional pleasure at all costs and avoid pain. And true hedonists don't. That principle guides everything they do. And even if you have to step on other people or abuse other people, you're the supreme subject of the spotlight's on you. Seek pleasure, avoid pain at all costs.
Yeah.
That's what's pushing our society right now. You think about that dark backdrop, and when a Christian comes against that, that's why they're so hostile to Christians. All religions really, but in particular Christianity, because it gets in the way of what their prime motive is.
Yep. Solomon tried that. He said it was all vanity. So, okay, let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you again. We thank you for the work that you are doing in this world to reverse the effects of the fall. We thank you for the victory that Jesus already had on the cross to do this. We thank you, though, that the work is ongoing, that the kingdom has come, but it's still not quite here yet, and we are still learning to be transformed into the image of Jesus. I pray, Father, that you will grip our hearts, draw us closer to yourself, so that we can be transformed, that we can set aside ourselves. We can set aside selfish conceit and ambition, and that we can learn to love others as you do, without any thought of our own self-promotion. Father, I pray now that you'll go with us into the service, be with the worship team as they bring us to your throne and worship and praise. Be with Pastor as he brings the message. Pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.